To invite Ellen Quigley to come and talk. She works in a day job actually for Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership in Cambridge, which is a very important organisation for promoting sustainable development and so on. But she has another life, and that was what her PhD was in, looking at economics education across the world, with a particular look in Canada, actually. So I asked her to give a response based on her research before we sort of open up to a wider discussion. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, and I don't mind, in fact I kind of like taking questions as I go, so feel free to jump in at any point and to let me know if I'm using jargon, because that's something that is to be avoided at all costs. I think we would probably agree. Very interesting talk. I agree with it all, and actually I feel like there are ways of having this discussion that do what you did, Stephen, which is to not immediately put economists on the back foot, because one of the things that we should do in critiquing economics is not to make the same mistakes that they in fact make. One of those is to kind of make blanket assumptions about large groups of people, or the way conceptual frameworks should work, and so on and so forth. So there's a way of looking at economics education that says, these are the benefits of a framework that allows you to look at bits and pieces of the economy. However, more context is probably required. And zooming out is something that has happened less and less. I might give just a bit of historical context to what Stephen's been saying, because I think that does help us to kind of put this in the big picture. Which is that economics education has become increasingly standardized, and the sorts of papers that Stephen just circulated have become more and more common. So this is a field that, it's unprecedentedly self-referential. It likes to rank itself more than any other social science by a long shot, and then they like to write articles about the rankings that they've conducted for themselves. So this is actually, I saw this paper and was completely unsurprised. It's a very typical piece of work on the part of economists. It's a very insular field, and there's a reason for that. One is it's become an incredibly standardized field. Everyone uses the same textbooks, the same concepts are taught literally everywhere in the world. Doesn't matter which language you're looking at. It doesn't matter which country, what level of education. It's pretty much all the same stuff now, and that's increasingly the case. So that's one piece of standardization, and that means that also it's had an effect on the people who've gone through. So if you talk to a younger economist now, they're much, okay, so what I discovered in my research, which is not conclusive and I wouldn't pretend it is, was that among the younger cohort of economists in Canada, there was much more of an attachment to laissez-faire economics, much less of a positive view of a role for government, and much less concern over things like income inequality, tax evasion, other issues that kind of implicate a sense of fairness, and so on and so forth. But I think in a way, the most interesting finding had to do with interdisciplinarity, because if we're talking about an insular field that has had an increasingly standardized approach to its subject matter, that's a pretty important piece. Does this field take into account anything from other fields? And the answer is this is a field that actually values interdisciplinary knowledge less than any other social science. And that is consistent across the board. But older Canadian economists fell outside this pattern incredibly. They lined up more with sociology professors in Sweden in terms of their support for interdisciplinarity, which I think is quite interesting, because from some other, I will simplify this a lot, but this older group, in fact, had a more pro-social orientation towards a whole bunch of different things, even though they had an unusual exposure to US-style economics. Over half of full professors in economics in the largest province in Canada, Ontario, those professors, more than half of those professors had PhDs from the US. So just incredible back and forth between these two countries in terms of their economics professional networks in particular. But also, the standardization of textbooks and so on is particularly strong with Canada and the US. It's all exactly the same stuff. And yet, there is this major difference in how quite a large swath of the profession viewed other fields. And this kind of, if you looked at some of the other things in my work, which no one will ever read, don't worry, you could kind of conclude two things. And I don't mean conclude as in this is definitive. I mean, you could explore further whether this might be true. But it seemed as though there was a countervailing effect of Canadian social norms, as in Canada as a whole cares more about income inequality, tax evasion, and has a stronger belief in a role for government than is true in the United States. That's pretty obvious if you look at polls. And that was reflected among economists, even though, for reasons I can get into, that does seem unlikely. But this was especially true for the older economists who had had a much more varied approach to economics in the first place. So they had a non-standardized economics education. So I did a whole bunch of interviews in addition to like a much more comparable survey. And in the interviews, people are talking about how there's this random Turkish Marxist in the really conservative department in the University of Calgary, and so on and so forth. Those stories completely disappeared for the younger generation. They were uniformly laissez-faire. They matched up with economists elsewhere, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what the loss of pluralism does. This became narrower and narrower as I looked at the cohorts. The oldest generation, so people in their 70s and above, were talked about multidisciplinarity in a way that was frankly inspiring. And then you got the baby boomers whose views differed less from one another, but who's, because they had, remember, things had narrowed somewhat even within that generation, as in the older generation selected for an ever narrower conception of economics. And then you ended up with this youngest cohort that had all studied exactly the same thing, and it was very apparent. The current form of economics and the standardization associated with that, you can kind of trace back some of the elements that make it so, that make this an unsurprising thing, even though it kind of turns on its head. The phrase, if you're not a liberal when you're young, you have no heart, and if you're conservative when you're older, you have no brain, etc. If you are exposed to certain concepts, and Stephen got into a little bit of this in his presentation, if you think in a calculative manner, if you induce a calculative mindset, there's some studies that suggest that you evaluate social problems differently. So if you express the same social problem in words as opposed to in numbers, the average person will actually come to a different conclusion, activates a different way of thinking. And there's a really interesting body of literature around how economics is taught in terms of the effects on people's behavior in a game that I'm not sure you'll have heard of, called the Ultimatum Game, which just involves giving one person in a pair $10, let's say, and then their job is to offer some proportion of that $10 to a partner, their partner in this game. And the only thing the other person can do is to either accept or refuse that offer. So if that person offers, say, 5 cents, the person can choose to either accept 5 cents and then the other person gets $9.95, or they can refuse and nobody gets any money. So what do you think is the most common offer in the general population?
50%.
Interesting.
$1.
No, so the most common offer among the general population is 50-50, even though it is technically illogical. Humans have a sense of fairness, it seems, such that is the most common single offer. Economists come in variably, but they're the most likely to offer $1, and their average is around $3 in many experiments. It varies somewhat, but they're a statistically significant way away from the average person's conception of this. And that depends on how they are taught. So a program that is more pluralist, that emphasizes kind of the context that we would all hope would be included. Things like other disciplines, psychology, for example, behavioral economics is a subfield of economics that has only came about because a bunch of psychologists became involved in economics, arguably a positive thing, showed that we're not exactly rational. Anyway, the addition of all of these other bits of context and more of a holistic view of economics can actually result in an unchanged response to that game. So still the most common offer being $5 out of the 10. Whereas with the standardized version of economics that we see all over the world right now, and that is inescapable for a student even who seeks out such an education, at least in leading universities, it is pretty much impossible to get a pluralist course. Those courses self-select for people who are less likely to want the context, the interdisciplinarity, the kind of prosocial view of economics. But they're also more likely to become the kind of person who doesn't value those things as much because of the social norms that are inculcated in them during that time. And all this probably sounds kind of far-fetched, but it's really interesting to see the body of work around this. Just studying how students behave even after one semester of economics in which they've been randomly assigned economics as opposed to another core class. Just seeing the effects that this can have on the way we think. So it's for reasons like this that books like Stephen's are very important. We need to start looking at the ways in which professors approach their field, but also the kinds of students we're educating who will then later become the professors we're hopefully critiquing for different reasons.
Thanks very much.